everyone. My name is Federico Santi. I'm a senior analyst for Europe at the Eurasia group. It's a great privilege to be hosting this discussion today. So first of all, a heartfelt thank you to the forum for the opportunity. Those of you who have been here all week, thank you for sticking around till the end. Those of you who just arrived, welcome. I am joined by a very distinguished set of speakers today. First of all, Asimakopoulou, who is a member of the European Parliament for New Democracy, Svitlana Kovalchuk, who leads the Yalta European strategy in Kiev, Vessela Tcherneva, who leads the European Council of Foreign Relations out of Sofia, and last but not least, Janis Emmanouilidis, who is the Director of Studies at the European Policy Center. So without further ado, I think all of you will have noticed that there have been a number of panels on the subject of Ukraine over the past few days. We're actually fortunate enough to have someone who is actually from Ukraine joining us on the panel today. So with that in mind, I would like to turn initially to Svitlana to begin with. I think there's also a tendency for those of us who look at the conflict at a distance to talk about it in somewhat abstract terms. So perhaps to set the scene, if you will, it would be great if you could give us a sense of the situation on the ground and also your assessment of how Europe and the EU has responded to the war so far from the perspective of Ukraine.
Thank you, Federico. First, I would like to thank organizers for putting this panel, for bringing Ukraine to Delphi Economic Forum. We had already dozens of panels about Ukraine, and I think it's vital important for Ukraine, it's vital important for Europe, and it's vital important for the whole world. And it's my pleasure to be here among such esteemed speakers and discuss today Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Actually, already 14 months ago, more than 1 year, this bloody war starts in Ukraine. Nobody expected that invasion will be so big. Nobody expected that Ukraine will withstand this bloody war. And nobody expected that Europe will show so big unity, unprecedented unity within the Europe. Nobody expected that whole war will be with Ukraine. And it was what Putin hasn't in mind. And it was his biggest mistake when he decided to start this bloody war. But now, as it's our last panel for this big forum, I would ask you to do a little bit weird things. I will ask you to close your eyes and imagine you are at your home in early morning, you wake up, for example, today and Saturday, and you open your curtains, and what you see through your windows? You see this big board saying, Russia is here for everywhere. And then you understand that it's war going in your country. You are afraid. Because you are afraid, each single minute, because someone can knock in your door and you can think. It can be a Russian soldier who will come to your home, and what they will do, they will find flag of your country, which you hide in parked in your flat. They can check your phone, and if you forget to delete correspondence on your phone, you can be arrested, you can be killed. They can take away your phone, and then you will be under occupation without any connection with relatives. And you will understand it's a reality. And it's a reality which have residents of more than 2,000 Ukrainian villages and cities. We are fighting for each matter of our land, but it's our really reality of our days. It can be also another example. For example, some weeks ago we had Easter, and what we see on each builder, it's a resident of small village, not far away from Kiev, only 20 kilometers. And this lady is preparing Easter cake in damaged part of her home. She lost everything. And this village is only 20 kilometers from Kiev. but you are happy. You don't see it in your country. And now in Ukraine we have such cities. It's Mariinka city in eastern Ukraine. It used to be lovely city with around 10,000 citizens. And now I think only God lives in these cities. And we have many destroyed, fully destroyed Ukrainian cities. I will show some other examples. So you see, it's Mariupol well known, how it used to be and what we have now in Mariupol. Nothing, everything is destroyed. Another Solidar. So it's why we are continue fighting. And it wouldn't be impossible without support we got from European Union as an institution for each country in Europe and beyond the Europe. And we are really, really grateful for the possibility to fight for our country, for our life, and to fight for our children, to let them live without fear, to be not afraid that someone can come and take you away, and you will be part of this big deportation process which are now happening in our country. In 21st centuries, a lot of Ukrainian children were now deported to Russia, and there is no clear end in it, and we are fighting to end it. And we are really, really very grateful for all support, all we got. But unfortunately, we need more because there is an ongoing war in our country. And when we will win, it will mean that we had everything for win. But as far as war continues, we will ask you for your more support. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's quite a sobering reminder of what things are really like on the ground, which is always useful. Turning to you next, Ms. Asimakopoulou, if I may. You obviously sit in the European Parliament, so you actually had a hand in shaping the EU's response to the war directly, in a sense. What is your assessment of how the EU has done so far? And I think we all follow developments to this date quite closely. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about what you see as the main challenges for the EU going forward, given that there's no indication that the war will de-escalate, let alone end anytime soon.
Thank you, and thank you for being part of this panel. And I think that the European Parliament has shown that we stand by Ukraine. I was there when President Zelensky came to address the Parliament. It was really a deeply moving story, and I'm very glad that this excellent event every year is dedicating, of course, time to talking about what's happening in Ukraine. It would be the least that the birthplace of democracy could do for your country. And as you know, Greece also stands with Ukraine. Now, you asked this question, what we've done. I mean, I have to say that I think that if the European Union, if you were to rank it on how well it responded to the financial crisis years ago, I would give it a pretty low mark. It wasn't ready, it didn't have the means, it didn't have the willpower. The pandemic was a little bit better. But I think Ukraine is a pretty good example of how we came together. We are united, and I'm quite certain we will remain united. There was a lot of talk that because these unprecedented sanctions that have been put on Ukraine are going to, at some point, because our citizens are paying the price, weaken our resolve. I think that hasn't happened. In practical terms, we've made available 50 billion euro to financial, humanitarian, emergency, budget, and military support, 37.8 billion for economic, social, and financial resilience. 18 billion just in 2023 alone. We're on the 11th round of sanctions and working to stop countries from helping these sanctions be evaded. We have 4 million Ukrainians in the European Union at the moment, and we're also giving artillery shells to Ukraine. within the next 12 months by digging into our own stockpile and doing some joint procurement on that. And training 30,000 Ukrainian troops. I know that's not enough. And, but it's, frankly, with European Union standards, it's a pretty decent response. What am I worried about? What are the challenges? Peace, of course. But the challenge is that, at some point, we're going to have to reconstruct what we just saw. We've given 100 million for schools at the moment. As you know, the Greek government has a particular sensitivity and has pledged to help with Mariupol. But that's a big, daunting task. I mean, I think I read somewhere, and it must have been a World Bank report, that it's going to take something like $400 billion to repair this damage. We have a donor platform. So I think what I would stop with this first intervention with is that we're going to have to make a massive effort to rebuild Ukraine. And I think even though peace hasn't been achieved yet, we have to start focusing on that. And I think, frankly, when there's 24 billion of assets of Russian oligarchs that we have seized or frozen around the world, I think we could use that money and pledge to use it for Ukrainian reconstruction. That would be, for me, a very big step in the right direction for the next day. Thank you.
Thank you. Janis, I think it's fair to say that the consensus is that the EU has, and Europe, have proven more cohesive than one might have assumed prior to the full-scale invasion in February last year. I wouldn't disagree with that necessarily, and I would take a slightly different view and tend to focus more on, I guess, what are the, some more outstanding issues that we tend to focus less on, perhaps. Would you want to develop that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And yes, also adding to what Asimakopoulou was saying, the narrative and the right narrative is that the EU has been more united, has been more decisive, has reacted faster to this, I would call it a chapter of the perma-crisis which we are experiencing at the European level now for 10 to 15 years. So if you compare it to other phases of that perma-crisis, the EU has done things which, at a speed, which you probably would have not thought would have been possible if you think some months even ahead of what happened on the 24th of February. And it did so for all the good reasons. Because as Svitlana reminded us, if you look into the situation in Ukraine, we have obviously a moral obligation to support your country, but we also have not only a moral obligation, but it's very much in our own self-interest to support Ukraine in this war which has been imposed on it. But if you look into the narrative of a more united, more decisive, faster reacting European Union, I think that that's only part of the story. I think given the gravity of the moment, the gravity of the consequences, the multiple consequences of this war, and that's not only geopolitical consequences, it's not only geopolitical consequences which are limited to Europe, it's also broader geopolitical consequences. If you see the links, and we've been discussing that a lot at the Delphi Forum, between what's happening in Ukraine and the situation far away in our relationship with China. These things are interlinked. When it comes to our future relationship with Russia, obviously, this is a core element of it. Our future transatlantic relations, so the geopolitical consequences are massive, but there are also massive geo-economic consequences which this war has, or potentially has. And we don't even know what the political fallout of this war will be also at the European level in EU countries when you look into the debates in different EU member states. So I think we cannot underestimate the gravity of the moment, the gravity of the consequences of the war in Ukraine. And if I look at this huge new era we live in, so the word watershed, which was used for the 24th of February, the word Zeitenwende, which was used by the German Chancellor, are right expressions for where we are. And we need to live up to that, which means we need to be even more ambitious. And here I see that we have a problem at the European level because we, yes, need to be united, but there are a lot of issues which are dividing us. On many core questions, on core issues, especially with the longer term future, we have severe differences among the EU27. And we can talk about that in more detail if you wish, but in general my appreciation is that these differences among the EU27 when it comes to core issues, to some of the very hot potatoes, in the previous panel in this room there was a discussion about China, about the relationship between EU and China, which is one of the issues which divides us, but there are many more, and we're not addressing these issues in a strategic way. We're rather pushing them aside because we fear that they might divide us. And as we want to show unity, and as I said, it is important to show unity, we're trying to avoid having discussions about some of these issues which are divisive, and I think that that is the wrong thing to do, because it not only stops us from reaching the level of ambition which we should have at the European level, it also has a negative effect on the decisions we're taking now, on the level of ambition of the decisions we're taking now, because if there are severe fundamental differences among the 27 with respect to the longer term future, this undermines unity and distrust among member states, and that is counterproductive in view of what we need to do at the European level. So I think the basic narrative is right, but if you look into the level of ambition which we should have, given the challenges we have, we should be far more decisive. And that is something which means we need to self-reflect, we need to look at whether our old recipes, the way we have been dealing with things, look at enlargement as one issue, and it's only one issue, that we need to be constructively asking ourselves, are we actually doing enough in view of the challenges ahead?
Thank you. Vessela, turning to you now, if I may. We've heard perspective from Ukraine. We have several perspectives from Brussels, one official, one not. I know you have a very good overview of the situation, of course, but also from your vantage point in Sofia, how do you see things at the moment with a particular emphasis on the Balkans and Eastern Europe in particular?
Thank you very much. I will try actually to do a couple of things. First, I will try to deconstruct a little bit this whole unity-disunity question, because we did a survey, a public opinion poll with ECFR among 10 European countries, 9 member states, and the UK, plus the US, China, Russia, and Turkey, and India, so 15 altogether. And I think what this survey showed is that this level of unity is not a given, that's correct, but the level of unity currently is unprecedented, actually. And maybe one thing that we political scientists tend to do a lot is to dwell a lot upon the differences of the member states, and to a bit over-talk, I think, the long-term kind of implications of that. Because I think for Europe, the short-term has always been more important. I mean, we tend to progress and to advance by short-term decisions that obviously have implications for the longer term. But our differences not necessarily take us to the doom that many predict. And this is, by the way, one mistake that I think Putin did. He was clearly convinced not only that Ukraine is not going to sustain, but also that the EU is going to fall apart and that there will be no united response. We did this survey. The first iteration of it was in May last year, and back then my colleagues Mark Leonard and Ivan Krastev asked the question of peace versus justice. And I have to say, back then I did not think this was the best way of framing the options. They meant that peace, that the peace option means we make peace now, no matter what the price, and Ukraine has to somehow, agree with that. Or justice meaning we need to see an end that is just for Ukraine, that is just for the international community, that foresees pushing Russia out. And so in May last year, the peace camp among Europeans was larger, actually much larger, rather than the justice camp. And when we did this survey again in the spring, it turned out that there is a big shift towards the justice camp, meaning a majority of Europeans think that there should be an ending to the war that really brings freedom to Ukraine, but also some punishment for Russia in terms of repaying the damage, in terms of international justice for war crimes, etc. Yet, in this last survey, what you can still see quite clearly is that you have three camps. So you have the northeastern hawks, who are very much on the forefront of basically going against the punishment option in full, kind of in full strength. Then there is the ambiguous West, with all the dependencies. We can talk about economic dependencies, kind of, I don't know, political affinities and so on. And then there is the southern weak links. In our survey, these are Italy and Romania, but I'm sure we can add many others, probably Bulgaria, probably Greece, and others, who really think that, you know, an end to the war is more important. Sorry. What are the drivers of this unity? I think the victory of Ukrainians in the field, clearly the decline of the nuclear threat, and thirdly, the energy solidity of Europe, and the fact that the EU looked much stronger than before the beginning of the war. Interestingly, the nationalists, I mean the nationalists and the populists and the radicals basically got reined into this when we looked also at the party structure of this response. Now the question is, how stable is this unity? And I think this is something that we keep discussing. I will try to highlight maybe two aspects of this. One is Central and Eastern Europe's role, which has grown in the past year, which is, I think, based on a mixture of kind of moral superiority and vulnerability. And the second focus I would, the second aspect I would like you to focus is the Franco-German engine, which is basically not working or not working the way it should be. With the French president's initiatives going out and being less European and more French to some people's taste, but also broad, fairly broad, and Germany basically retreating to some sort of a German corner in this. One positive angle, positive reading of the upcoming American presidential election, because I think it plays a huge role in all of this, is that if Trump gets the Republican nomination, paradoxically that may actually bring Germany and France closer together. And I think this is going to give us a new momentum in that front. But the question in general is what role for the US we see and as we go forward. And I think ultimately, whoever is in the White House, they will be seeing Europe as kind of the primary actor in taking care of Ukraine after the war. That means taking care of it financially. Currently, we're kind of on par with the US. But secondly, taking care of it politically. And here we come to your question on enlargement and what can we do. I think we have to really rethink the whole model, and this is quite visible. It doesn't matter which capital you're talking about. We heard the Austrian Chancellor half an hour ago saying, you know, the enlargement is possible only if we get the Western Balkans first. There should be no fast track for Ukraine. On the other hand, the Western Balkans say this promise is not as credible as it used to be 15 years ago, so what are you really offering to us? And I think this is a fair question, especially given the Turkish elections and given the fact that a lot of European politicians think that if there is a change of guard in Ankara, we may end up with yet another candidate for negotiations for the EU. All of that can divide the EU enormously, and I think this is one of the points which we can see basically explode in our faces if we don't discuss it properly. And last but not least, as you mentioned, China, it has an imprint in the Balkans, but it also has a huge impact on the perceptions of Europeans for their economic future. So we talk about de-risking with China, but we are willing to also outsource some of the peace-making effort in Ukraine to China. We are also willing to give them enough space in the Western Balkans to take up the room that has been freed out by Russia. All of this puts a lot of questions in front of Europeans, and I think this is probably going to be the most difficult, but also diplomatically interesting couple of years that we're expecting.
Thank you. You touched on a lot of key themes there, so plenty of food for thought. I'm familiar with the survey, and I agree it was quite revealing. I think you're right to focus on sort of national differences, divergences. I, for one, am from Italy originally. I can certainly attest to the fact that just the public debate in Italy on the war is much more muddled and ambivalent than it is in countries where there is more of a national consensus. Poland, the UK, just to name a couple. And I'd like to come back to some of the themes that you raised later, particularly the accession question, which I agree is really crucial. But again, turning to Svitlana, if I may, once again to help us set the stage. Looking ahead, looking forward, as I mentioned earlier, it's clear to everyone that you know, this war is not going away. This is more of a slog than a sprint, to use a phrase. Ukraine is very heavily dependent on help from the West, the EU, the US, militarily, in terms of, you know, financial support just for the day-to-day running of the government. Coming down the line, there are already big questions, as was mentioned earlier, about reconstruction, which will be a huge challenge. Again, not to mention EU accession, which is related to all of the above. Where do you see, I guess, the biggest needs on the Ukrainian side? In other words, what does Ukraine need on the part of the EU to be able to, you know, I don't want to say thrive as a country, but, you know, continue to live through this war, first of all, and hopefully at some point move past it?
Thank you, Federico. It's really a very good question. I would come back a little bit to the granted candidate status for Ukraine. We all understand that it's a big issue. Politically, it was really important for Ukraine, for Ukrainian government, for me, like citizen of Ukraine, because we need to understand our future, the way forward. And candidate status for us, it means clear reforms agenda, which we are doing actually for the last 20 years. And this candidate status helps us to be more concentrated on reforms. And we understand that within 1 or 2 years, it's impossible to make all necessary reforms which are needed. And now our priorities are, of course, rule of law, and independent institutions, good working state system, and we are continuing hard working on this process. And of course, we understand the whole market should be reformed. We will make our market closer to the EU standard, and to give our economy more possibilities, because we don't need, now we are not only fighting, we continue to function like a state, like a country, and our businesses to continue to work. And recently it was like a really big crisis, and we thank you, European Union, for support, and we really hope that we will continue to receive European support and move further, because for us it's like a light in the end of tunnels. Yeah, we understand that our future is European future, and we are ready to work on it very hard. When it happens, we hope that very soon, but it's a process, yeah. But most important is, in this frame, is reform process, and I'm really hope, and I'm sure that we will do all necessary we have to do, because for us it's like a different front. As our President Zelensky tell all the time, we have military front, we have economic front, we have culture front, and we are fighting now on different fronts all the times. About our, coming back to you actually questions, what do we need now? What our priorities are as for now? Let me speak about short-term, middle-term, and long-term priorities. Of course, our short-term priorities is weapons. We need to receive weapons as soon as possible. We got already a lot of different weapons, a lot of different systems, and we are really very, very grateful for it. But as it's continuing war, we have even more new needs. And even now, the question is not all the times about delivering different kind of weapons, but also about speeds. And my government, my president's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, they all the time asking, please, give us weapons you promise, but please give us as soon as possible. Because as soon as we will get it, the more lives we can save. If it's possible to rebuild cities, but it will be absolutely impossible to get people life back. And each single day, a lot of people are dying in Ukraine. Even within 1 hour, in general, 3 people dying in Ukraine. 1 civilians and 2 soldiers. Even yesterday, we had this brutal, again, attack on absolutely civilian city in central Ukraine, early in the morning when people were asleep. And Russian missile hit 9th-floor residential house. 23 people were killed, and among them 3 children. We will never back all the people back. It's why we are asking to provide us weapons as soon as possible. Of course, as we are suffering all the time from the rockets, we ask to strengthen Ukrainian aircraft and anti-missile defense system and make it part of the air raid system of neighbor European countries. And of course, we ask all countries to start immediate training of Ukrainian pilots for F-16 and enable the provision of Ukraine combat aircraft of Western production, because it's highly important. It's our short-term perspective. And also last week, a new document on sanctions was developed in Ukraine by the working group headed by the head of the Office of President, Mr. Yermak, and Ambassador McFall. And we asked to strengthen sanctions. And in this package, we asked to strengthen sanctions against the Russian oil and gas sector, against nuclear industry, and also against absolutely anyone who helps Russian to avoid restrictions caused by European sanctions. It's really what we need to defend ourselves, not only in front, but also in the real economical life. About our medium-term perspectives and our needs, what we need really to increase capacities of logistics and repair hubs, because thanks all international hubs, we got more and more weapons, more armed vehicles, but more tanks, but they need to be repaired. And for making it possible, we need new logistic and repair hubs in Ukraine, in our neighbor countries, because sometimes it's more quicker to repair its Ukraine. Sometimes it will be needed to send back to the Europe to make it repaired. Of course, we ask our allies to expand a program for Ukrainian military, especially training program, because we understand we can be successful if our soldiers will be trained on new military standards. And of course, we need new ammunitions, and it could be like an ongoing process. And speaking about long-term priorities, of course, we ask our allies to develop new defense, common defense policy, which will include also Ukraine and guarantee security of Ukraine.
Thank you, Svitlana. That was an excellent and, if I may, very practical overview. Very multifaceted, let's say, set of issues and challenges. Ultimately, going forward, this, however, I would say hinges on the EU's willingness to continue standing by Ukraine, which in turn is a reflection of the position in different governments and ultimately of domestic politics in various countries. On this front, I think when the war first broke out, particularly after the spike in energy prices, many people warned of a potential new wave of support for populist parties, which in turn could once again undermine support for the EU, support for Ukraine, a similar dynamic to what we got used to seeing on the back of the Eurozone crisis, for instance. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Janis, on this. Were you surprised that this hasn't been the case yet? And more importantly, are you worried that, with inflation becoming more sticky, taking more of a toll on real incomes for probably years to come, that this could become an issue again, in your view?
Let me first respond to the previous question which you posed to Svitlana. And I think, yes, Svitlana, you showed what your country needs. And that includes, obviously, military support. It includes economic support, humanitarian, and also support for the reconstruction of the country. And obviously, you have a long time dimension, which we have in front of us, which also means that we need to, as an EU, to show the persistence in supporting Ukraine. One fear which one can have is that if the conflict, the war in Ukraine, is no longer in the headlines, that might also have a negative effect on our strategic persistence with respect to our support to Ukraine. But I want to pick up something which you said in the beginning when you were talking about the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that this is equally significant to the concrete support which the country needs. Because if the analysis is incorrect, I'm not a military expert and I'm not pretending to be one, but if the analysis is correct that this conflict might last long, that we might be witnessing a cold war in the sense, even if it's no longer a hot war, that we might witness a cold peace. So this could and potentially will be a very long conflict. So that means that the country needs to have a strategic perspective of where it wants to move to. And that makes me think about EU enlargement, which you mentioned. And here I think we have given, obviously, the candidate status to Ukraine, but there are severe differences among the 27. Let's be frank, there are some who want to avoid the EU to enlarge to Ukraine. And that is not because they're predominantly thinking of Ukraine, but because they're predominantly thinking of the EU itself. There are others who want the EU to enlarge as fast as possible. So you have severe differences among the EU. But I think one term which you were using, Vessela, was credibility. And when it comes to enlargement, we do not have a high degree of credibility. You were mentioning the Western Balkans. Let's also look at Turkey, where the question of credibility is, I think, a severe question. And I think we should, and I said it as I said in the beginning, we need to draw the right lessons from the multiple consequences of the 24th of February, of the Zeitenwende, the new era. And one of the lessons is that we need to be, again, credible when it comes to enlargement, because now it is, again, a strategic imperative. I do not know when enlargement will happen, which countries might join, but what I know is that we need to be credible, which means that we need to prepare ourselves to actually be ready to enlarge the European Union. So that's the other side of the coin. You were talking about the need to reform your country, which is an enormous task. Also, the reforms in countries in the Western Balkans who want to join is an enormous task. But there's also an enormous task which the EU has in front of us in terms of preparing itself for being able at some point in time to enlarge, because otherwise you will not have credibility. And I don't see that being pushed forward. And then comes the argument, we will reform the European Union when we get to the point where actually enlargement will be in front of us. And I think this is the false argument, it's the false narrative, because reforming the EU is going to be a huge task. And that is something which you cannot postpone to the final moment. And actually, if you look back into the reform history of the EU, in view of the Big Bang enlargement of 2004, 2007, it took the EU's rounds of attempts to reform itself in order to be at a position where there was a feeling we can now cope with the big enlargement we witnessed at the time. So let's not think that we will be able within one go to reform the European Union. And that is something where our credibility, I think, is at stake, and we need to work on that.
I think Vessela wanted to pick up there on that.
Can I have a two-finger? Yes.
Please.
I think the dilemma is actually not whether we prepare ourselves or not. I think the dilemma is what kind of enlargement we should prepare ourselves for. Whether we are sticking to the current form and shape, which seems to be highly problematic in many of the member states. And I think if you're currently an enemy of enlargement, the best way to keep your position is to, insist on the current rules. Because the more rigid enlargement is, the less probable it becomes. So if you really want to push forward enlargement, I think, and this is what many of us want, the realistic option is to start and think about reforming the process itself, which will also mean, in a way, reforming the EU, because it's what you think about yourself, what do you think your toolbox is, how you see the EU in, 10, 15, 20 years. And given where the debate is currently, I would say that most probably we will have to start thinking about some form of, different voting rights, different, scale of closeness to a certain core of the EU and so on. Slicing up the enlargement in pieces, having kind of various formulas of presence or participation of candidate countries in different topics. But I think we have to be very serious about enlargement, and the only way to be serious about it is to say the current enlargement formula is not working.
Going back to something that we touched on earlier in my previous question, Ms. Asimakopoulou, if I may, you are, of course, a politician. I know that you yourself and the Greek government as well have been very clear in their support for Ukraine so far. That does not apply necessarily to the entire political spectrum in Greece and in Europe. Greece has elections coming up this year, maybe 2 elections coming up this year, European elections next year. Are you worried about an erosion in support for the EU's policy on Ukraine and Russia going forward?
Like you said, I mean, at the moment, with the Mitsotakis government, Greece has a very clear line on where we are. We've even, you know, I mean, we're not a big military provider, but we've done whatever we could in providing tangible military support. And I, of course, respect and understand what Svitlana's saying. You know, I mean, if you're a country, you're at war, you're being attacked, people are being killed, what you need is weapons and money. I mean, that's what you need, and you need it urgently. So we've done what we could, and I'm certain that this government will continue to be on the right side of history when it comes to it. Now, yes, there have been voices in the opposition that are not so thrilled with this, especially with the provision of military support. So am I worried? Well, you know, I'm obviously on one side of the elections. You know, it's very clear who I would like to see win the election. So if they do, then, you know, if Mitsotakis continues in power, I'm not worried. If there's another situation, I can't predict exactly what would happen. And if I can make a comment on the discussion that preceded this. Enlargement is a difficult topic at the moment in the EU for many, many reasons. And I think that I couldn't agree more that this is a question of credibility for the EU, especially when it comes to the Western Balkans. When it comes to Turkey, maybe it's a question of credibility, probably a question of credibility from the Turkish side. I mean, is it credible at this point in time with what Turkey has been doing that they actually deserve to be a European Western country in the European Union? That's a big question mark, and that question mark has led to the accession negotiations being frozen. But in the case of the Ukraine, there is a justification symbolically also for moving forward ahead of the curve. Having said that, it's quite clear that there are some parts of this procedure that can't be fast-tracked. I mean, accession is a procedure, and it has steps, and no matter how quickly you want to go through them, it takes time. And especially when you're in a situation like you're in, it probably takes even more time. But we would like to see Ukraine as close to us as possible. And I'll tell you something else. I mean, I believe in big ideals and keeping us united, and Ukraine has done that. But ultimately, in the end, politics and external relations are about self-interest. That's the truth. And we've seen that in many forms of European cohesion and disintegration at moments in time. Ukraine is a very important partner for the European Union for many reasons, not just geopolitically, not just because of democracy, not just because of the new multipolar world order, not because we're in the age of perma-crisis, which I agree, and there's many crises that we could help deal with. I'll tell you something that nobody ever talks about in the context of Ukraine: critical raw materials. This is our big thing in Europe now. We want this digital and green transition. To do that, we need critical raw materials. We get 90% of our critical raw materials from China. China is weaponizing this clearly. We have partners that we've been looking to, and before the war in Ukraine, we had signed a partnership agreement with Ukraine about critical raw materials, because Ukraine has just about everything we could possibly need, for batteries to wind turbines to everything else. So any way Europe looks at it, and this is what we're going to have to keep at the forefront of our citizens, this is first and foremost about democracy and freedom and the values that we stand for. But even through other multipolar geopolitical perspectives, or the self-interest of our own priorities, our own competitiveness, which has security ramifications, it's a no-brainer that we have to stay together when it comes to Ukraine. And certainly, to come back to Greek domestic politics, the Mitsotakis government will be on that side of the argument.
Sticking with the accession theme, which seems to be of interest to all, I'd like to hear from Svitlana quickly on the Ukrainian side again. It's clear that accession is very important politically to provide a sort of a sense of direction for relations with the EU. It has very real economic implications as well for reconstruction, in terms of solidifying the outlook for market access, just to name one very important aspect. It's a crucial anchor of the domestic reform progress for Ukraine. I'm curious to better understand what are the expectations on the Ukrainian side, on the part of the government, and also the public when it comes to EU accession, because I think we're all in agreement that this is going to be very complicated and probably will take a long time.
Our expectation is from government side and from side of simple citizens that is going to happen very soon. But soon we haven't discussed, it's like several months or several years. It's a process, and for us important to be a part of this process because it will mean our internal reforms, and it will mean for us not only to ask about help, but it will mean for us to produce something within the country, having European support. Because now we are in the position when we fully depend from international support. Yeah, we are at the war, we have actually no budget, and we can only continue to function like a state receiving international support. And for us, like European accession, European integration, it's about possibility to be independent, to continue to have our own budget and see what future we can do all together within the European. But we understand it will be critical, it will be not so easy, and even within the European Union, it will demand a high discussion, because recently I discussed with President Kwasniewski accession of Poland to the European Union, and he told me it was also very big discussion within the European Union, and it was really a very simple example about support, agriculture support, because money were divided between member states, and adding Eastern European states, it means that Eastern European states will receive money which was supposed for South European countries. Yeah, it was unpleasant moment, but it was all about development of countries and all for prosperous, better future of European Union. And I'm sure, even taking into account crisis of last week, it seems to me we have on this agriculture, it will be more and more such type of crises, but we can resolve it only being united.
Thank you, very, very interesting. Staying with this topic, Janis, as Mr. Asimakopoulou reminded us, the EU, most EU countries have a very strong public position in favor of EU membership eventually. There are lots of problems with it, as you reminded us before, in terms of the Balkans, potentially Turkey. But simply on the European side, I think events over the last week have also already highlighted what some of the more practical challenges around membership could be. I'm thinking of the spat between Poland and Hungary on grain imports, Poland, of course, being otherwise one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine. Very important decision these days on whether or not to extend tariff-free trade with Ukraine going forward. I have the feeling that these questions are not really being addressed publicly. What's your view on that?
Yeah, you're right that the last couple of weeks have shown how difficult it is, but also if you have discussions behind closed doors, you see how much of a divided issue this is among the EU27. And I think if you are, as I am, of the belief that following the 24th of February, enlargement again needs to be a strategic imperative, you also need to be honest about it. And this is a process that will take years. This is not about months, it's about years. And it's about years because Anna's right, there is no fast track. Everybody needs to be ready. The EU needs to be ready, but the countries joining also need to be ready, because early accession can also put a lot of pressure on a country who has joined. So it's on both sides' interest that one is ready to enlarge the European Union, and one needs to be serious and honest about that. But having said that, I want to take up something which Vessela mentioned. We need to be more creative in terms of the enlargement process. You didn't use the word, but we should be thinking about staged accession process. We should think about alternative models of how to enlarge the European Union. I remember having had these discussions, by the way, in this room in 2007, 2008, about whether we need to think about enlargement in different ways. And at the time, we were told that you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're in or out, there's nothing in between. But I think that if the analysis is correct, that this has been and is a Zeitenwende, is something where we have to rethink things more fundamentally. We also have to look at whether enlargement, the way we have conducted it thus far, is the right process, or whether there are other ways of dealing with it, whether there are ways of staged accessions where countries can join within a system which is credible. It's not about, you know, letting them into a certain point, but actually not allowing them to become full members. It's not an alternative, but we should be thinking about this. And there are thoughts, there are concrete ideas, proposals out there which are being discussed, but I have the feeling that we still are stuck in the old way of thinking about enlargement because that's what we're used to. And it seems also to be easier. And I think we need to get rid of the stereotypes of old recipes and old taboos if we actually believe that this is a new period in which we live in, which I seriously think is the case. So we need to also, when it comes to enlargement, ask ourselves whether the old model is actually tenable and whether it makes sense.
Vessela, you gave us, going back to something that you mentioned earlier, you gave us a interesting, I thought, overview of different positions within the EU when it comes to Ukraine. Despite this, I guess, broad unity on the issue so far, there are clearly concerns with some specific countries, Hungary, of course, being the first that comes to mind. What's your view on, you know, what could be the, I don't want to say problem areas, but some of the countries where we could see support for Ukraine fray first, not least given the, you know, several elections that are coming up in the next few years?
Well, this is I think that in policy terms, this is probably the most important issue from a European perspective. And I would highlight, I mean, two elections. We have talked a lot about the Turkish election in this forum. And this is going to have clear implications on what Europeans think about enlargement and about the prospects of Ukraine in particular. The second election that is very relevant is clearly the Polish election. Poland is going to have also, I think, a moment where a Zeitenwende could happen. Whether this is going to materialize or not is a big question, not only for Poland, for Central and Eastern Europe, but also for Europe in general. There is a kind of feeling in Poland that the center of gravity in Europe is shifting eastward. I am not 100% convinced that this is actually the case on the important files, but on the war and on Ukraine, this election is going to have very important impact. Last but not least...
If I may, sorry, since you raised Poland, I'm certainly no expert, but my feeling also from talking to people at the conference here is that the stance on Ukraine and support for Ukraine is maybe the one thing that they actually agree on generally, right?
True, but it's about Poland's position within the EU. It's what kind of EU Poland wants to see, what kind of role Poland wants to have. We say 4 million Ukrainians are in the European Union today, but actually probably 3 million of them are in Poland. You know, how much of that burden Poland can continue carrying, and what kind of legitimacy a government would have that continues this effort. So this is important. And last but not least, and probably this is my most serious concern if you ask me about the political attitudes towards Ukraine, this is unfortunately Orban's position again, because he has been pushing this symbolic politics, Trianon and so on, you know this all. Now also vis-a-vis Ukraine, there is a very strong risk that Hungary vetoes the start of the negotiation with Ukraine over minority issues. And if this happens, this is going to, put another layer, add another layer to this very complex European debate.
Thank you. Turning from, I guess, the more political questions to more concrete financial matters, if I may. Ms. Asimakopoulou, earlier you... Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I'm sorry that we have to draw this to an earlier conclusion. I was looking at a different timer. Thank you all.